Good evening, everybody. My name is Professor Roger Kirby, and I'm President of the Royal Society of Medicine. It's a great pleasure to introduce you to this 10-part series on the health emergency of climate change. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Michael Rapp for his generous support of this series, and it's my pleasure and honour to introduce to you His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, who will tell you more about what you can expect from this series.
Ladies and gentlemen, the world is currently in the midst of the worst health crisis in living memory. Over the past year, we have witnessed an unprecedented test of the resilience of our global systems due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Similarly, the growing emergency of climate change and biodiversity loss poses a far greater long-term threat to the health of humanity, the planet, and the challenges we face across global health. After all, human health, planetary health, and economic health are fundamentally interconnected. It is extraordinary how easily it seems to have been forgotten that the integrity of the natural environment is absolutely vital to human health and well-being. Biodiversity, the incredible interconnectedness of plant, animal, and insect life, which we are rapidly and rashly destroying, holds insights and solutions that we have yet to discover. Its protection and genuinely sustainable management is crucial to our survival as a human species. It is therefore increasingly clear that when we care for our planet, we fundamentally care for ourselves. The reverse is also true, as tragically demonstrated by the increasing incidence of zoonotic diseases, of which COVID-19 is but one. If we look at the planet as if it were a patient, we can see that our activities have been damaging her immune system, and she has been struggling to breathe and thrive due to the strain we have put on her vital organs. To treat her, we need to restore balance and put nature back at the center of the circle. This lies at the heart of my recently launched Terra Carta, which offers the basis of a recovery plan for nature, people, and planet. Most of us are, at this stage, only too aware of the devastating environmental and health effects of climate change and the threat this poses to human life. For instance, we know that climate change and tropical deforestation are complicating our attempts to eliminate malaria as they threaten and reduce biodiversity, which might hold some of the keys to a solution. One of our standard and most effective treatments, artemisinin, is of course derived from a natural plant, sweet wormwood. We've already made ourselves alarmingly vulnerable through mass extinctions and the loss of countless beneficial species in destroyed rainforests, which might have helped provide the source of future medical treatments. After all, as Dr. Eric Chivian of the Center for Health and the Global Environment at Harvard Medical School has been trying to point out for many years, nature has been providing medicines to treat our diseases and relieve our suffering for many thousands of years. Most prescribed medicines used in industrialized countries today are still derived from or patterned after natural compounds from plants, animals, and microbes. Who knows, for instance, what plants or predators we may need to call upon in future, whose potential to treat human disorders is still as yet unknown to science. Without urgent biodiversity regeneration, I fear these properties may well be lost to us forever. Equally, of course, the destruction of habitat increases the incidence of vector-borne diseases, and there is an acute awareness that extreme climate change may, in the nearer future, make some regions virtually uninhabitable. This was very much in the forefront of my mind when, in late 2013, at the Royal College of Surgeons, and through my International Sustainability Unit, I brought together health experts to explore the relationship between health, climate change, and the environment. This led to support for the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change and also the Global Climate and Health Alliance, which was an articulate interlocutor in the run-up to the Paris Agreement. I am therefore particularly delighted to introduce this 10-part series in which the Royal Society of Medicine will position health and well-being at the very centre of the discussion around climate change, with the crucial aim of promoting an understanding of its impact on human health. Each episode will focus on the health conditions and specialities affected, covering topics including air pollution and the impact on our health, the cardiovascular effects of rising temperatures and extreme heat, the mental health toll of climate change, changing climates and new pandemics, and the health of the unborn child and children. This series will also cover how sustainable practices can mitigate the impact of healthcare systems on the climate, offering, for instance, recommendations for how healthcare professionals can alter their practice to reduce the negative impact on the climate, insight into the sustainable initiatives being used by the NHS and other healthcare systems around the world, and advice for healthcare professionals looking to have a positive impact and help promote sustainability at work and at home. Each episode will feature leading authorities in the field of climate change and health from around the world, who will present the latest evidence and clinical research into this planetary emergency. The voices of younger doctors will also be heard throughout the series, joining the discussion alongside the panel of experts. After all, it is this generation and their children who will bear the brunt of the climate change health crisis, and they are key to ensuring that change is not delayed. Ladies and gentlemen, the Royal Society of Medicine hopes, as of course do I, that this series will promote further critical research and encourage health professionals to provide world-class care using new sustainable approaches. Together, we can mitigate climate change and the resultant health detriments in order to address the increasingly urgent need for action.
Good evening. I'm Linda Luxon, and I'm a trustee and honorary treasurer at the Royal Society of Medicine. I'm very pleased to welcome you tonight to this, our first programme in the Royal Society of Medicine's 10-part series on the health emergency of climate change. I'd like to start by thanking His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales for very graciously and comprehensively introducing this series, which aims to position health right at the centre of the climate change debate. And as Prince Charles said, while we hear very frequently about the environmental impacts of climate change, we hear much less frequently about the health impacts. And as a health professional, I'd like to emphasise what an important role we have in mitigating climate change, and thus what a huge opportunity we have to benefit health, not only through changes in our own clinical practice, but by changes in supporting the healthcare systems that we work in to ensure sustainable policies, and also to advocate to government to introduce policies that mitigate climate change. So against that background, I'm delighted to introduce tonight 4 outstanding speakers who spent much of their careers working in this area: Professor Hugh Montgomery, Dr. David Pencheon, Dr. Tolullah and Professor Howard Frumkin. So thank you very much, Hugh. Would you like to start the evening?
It was in 2008-09 that the first Lancet Commission on Health and Climate Change, a multidisciplinary, multinational report, stated that climate change was the greatest threat to human health of the 21st century. And whilst that might seem difficult to believe in the time of COVID, it remains true, and we need to remind ourselves of the level of that threat. Let's just remind ourselves about the greenhouse gases. We know that they let shortwave radiation through. They trap long-wave radiation. And we're adding massively to that burden of greenhouse gases every year. Indeed, for the last year for which we have data, this is what we currently burn. And that vast quantity of greenhouse gases from that combustion goes into a very thin atmosphere, raising the concentration and trapping energy. Indeed, if you look at the entire atmosphere of the Earth and wrapped it at standard temperature and pressure into a sphere, the entire volume compared to the size of the Earth would be that pink sphere shown on the right of your screens. Consequently, concentrations have gone up dramatically. It's not just the absolute quantity, but this is a rate. Let's look back at atmospheric CO2 concentrations in the last 800,000 years, and they go up and down with natural cycles. But in the last 50 or so years, that vertical line to the right is what we've achieved. This is unprecedented at the rate and scale. That's around 5 Hiroshima bombs of energy every single second being added to our atmosphere that isn't going anywhere else. And this has a vast number of health impacts, and I haven't got time to go through them in great detail, but let's look at the vector-borne diseases such as dengue, schistosomiasis, and malaria. Dengue and malaria, of course, being transmitted by a mosquito. Dengue is a flavivirus. It's transmitted, as we say, by the mosquito, which feeds exclusively by day. But rising temperatures and changed water patterns mean those mosquitoes can live in a very, very much greater habitat than before. So the population exposed is greater. But in those higher temperatures, the virus replicates more quickly. The total viral load in the stomach of the mosquito rises. The mosquitoes breed more quickly. They feed more frequently. And consequently, those synergistic interactions increase the number of people and how severely they're affected by dengue. And the same, of course, applies to malaria as well. We can look at food availability. These are the projections for the climate countdown, looking at impacts on staples throughout the world, with these drops coming this century against, let's remember, a rising number of people in our population. But these impacts, of course, are massive underestimates. Anyone who's had a garden knows that you can have a wonderful growing season, and you need one sharp frost, one period of snow, one drought, one heat wave, and you lose your entire crop. And so these projections that come from stable warming don't take into account extreme weather events. And if you add more and more energy to an atmosphere, you get more and more weather. It's energy in atmospheres that causes weather. And we've been seeing these increasing number of extreme weather events all around the world. This from Carbon Brief, who's been mapping them for just recent events flagged around the world. Those that we know scientifically are directly attributable to climate change are marked in yellow. And you'll see that's much the preponderance. Those that we know where scientifically there is no human influence are in blue, and they're very, very much in the minority. And this number has been going up very steeply. These weather events being snow events and increased rainfall, cyclones, for instance, but also heat waves. Heat waves, of course, in terms of their human direct impact, only matter where humans live. And we tend not to live on the ocean or in frozen areas or very high and so forth. We live in cities, which are largely coastal on land masses. So the number of people exposed, and particularly those vulnerable people, is going up very steeply. And this impacts, as we've discussed, on food, again, not just around the rest of the world. Remember that those sudden warm and cold oscillations followed by droughts led to a very, very poor wheat harvest in Great Britain, as it did in the rest of Europe. Other extreme weather events, though, are also happening around the world. Let's remember only 18 months or so ago that Australia was ablaze. Huge areas of vegetation burned, koalas rendered essentially functionally extinct with 80% loss of their habitat. And whilst that's the one that made the big news, Siberia has an ongoing fire. In July, it had already destroyed half the area of Greece in Siberia, and this is burning through peat. It can't be put out, and it's melting methane hydrates, methane being a 23 times more powerful greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide. The Amazon is ablaze. And again, I'll let you look at those numbers there in terms of areas affected. Angola and the Congo in Africa are affected actually to a greater extent even than the Amazon is. Indonesia is affected. And we know also that California is affected now almost annually by these severe fires. So this is a worldwide epidemic of fires, as well as of cyclones, rainfall, snowfall, and so forth. All of these things have massive economic impacts, and we as healthcare professionals all understand that poverty is a major driver of poor health worldwide. Nick Stern's report suggested that climate change would have an impact worse than the two wars and the Great Depression combined. He's retracted that statement now because it's going to be very, very, very much worse than that. So let's run through then a quick summary of the synergistic interactions that climate change has on human health. We get change in pollen allergenicity, different plants, pollen burden, and increased spring seasons. We get heat waves, which cause fires, which cause particulate pollution. And together with ground level ozone increases, we get increases in respiratory disease. The heat waves and particulates themselves produce, and with ground level ozone, drive cardiovascular disease. And of course, to the right there, remember all of these health impacts have mental health impacts. The heat waves themselves and fires cause drought, reduced work capacity, high rainfall events, flooding, along with sea level rise, all of that interacting with ecosystem collapse, which we shouldn't forget, of course, already 8 species an hour becoming extinct, driving loss of crops and starvation. We've got algal blooms with increased water temperatures and flooding leading to chemical poisoning and ill health, bacterial diseases causing diarrhea and stunting as well in vulnerable populations. Vector-borne diseases we've spoken of, but remember that with poverty, loss of habitation, and the starvation and other impacts lead to mass migration. And from mass migration and loss of resource comes conflict. And this is a very, very major, not just threat, but something that's already occurred. The Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society made this statement around 10 years ago, that we could no longer rely on the planetary stability which our species has depended upon. And therefore, it's a reminder that humanity is risking itself. We've heard far too long that climate change threatens our grandchildren. Well, it does, but it threatens us now, particularly for many of you in this audience who will be a great deal younger than I am. And if you have children or are thinking of having children, there is a very, very grave threat, not just to their survival, but this century to the survival of our civilization and ultimately to our species.
Thank you so much, Hugh. That was an excellent introduction to the series and a really good overview of the mechanisms by which climate change affects health. The next 4 programs in this series are going to be on respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, dermatology, and gastrointestinal disease. And I just wonder, do you think that most healthcare professionals are aware that all those different disciplines are affected by climate change?
So, simple answer, no. In terms of the pace and scale of the action we need to head off the problems, people aren't aware. For me, the thing to focus on is the fact that the things that improve your cardiovascular, respiratory, and digestive health also, by chance, happen to massively impact on climate change. So if you walk and cycle and take active transport, that exercise improves your mental health. It lowers your risk of osteoporosis. It lowers your risk of cardiovascular and coronary vascular disease, particularly, but also stroke and peripheral vascular disease. It lowers your risk of obesity, diabetes, of many forms of cancer. So active transport, good for the planet, good for you. In terms of your lungs, the same things. In terms of your diet, I moved to a largely vegetarian diet. I still do eat meat if it's served me. I don't be churlish and say, I'm sorry, I can't touch this. But I'm largely vegetarian based. I did that for climate change reasons and then realized as a white male that I'd colossally reduced my risk of bowel cancer, amongst other conditions too. So for these conditions, I would focus much more on the fact that you can improve your health by also taking action that also improves the health of the planet.
Thank you very much, Hugh. And I think the message that a healthy lifestyle gives rise to a healthy planet and mitigates climate change is an excellent message to get across. But may I just ask you, what can those of us do that are listening to this program that want to make a difference? What can we do?
So the actions firstly are the small scale stuff that sounds small beer, but it's when we all do these things together, we all jump together and then the earth moves. So the personal actions, the first one is to go online, find one of the very good free carbon calculators to calculate your carbon footprint. You put all your numbers in, it will tell you what your carbon footprint is, and it'll give you the easy wins. So some of that for the people who do choose to fly, maybe that's a very easy win, huge reductions in tons of carbon a year. Simple things like turning a radiator down by 1 degree reduces CO2 emissions by between 7 and 11% per degree. So as in, I'm sitting here with no heating on, you'll notice I've got a down duvet jacket on underneath my jacket and I'm fine. And that means my carbon footprint there is lower. It'll show IT, it'll show food. It will show you where you can make your difference together. Look at your place of work. It really, really matters. We've now got Sir Simon Stevens committed to a zero carbon NHS. So let's work with our trust to take this seriously. We can all make savings in electricity at our hospitals. We managed to take out 1/3 of our light bulbs in communal areas. That was a reduction of 1/3 immediately in that. I went for a walk around with our security lead on a Friday night, just to see what was still left on. It was horrifying what was on in shut outpatient departments, closed physio departments and so forth, but also moved to green energy supplies, which are of course now highly competitive in the marketplace, and look at procurement. If any trust builds in to its contracts to say in 4 years' time, first ranking thing will be your environment footprint, and after that will come price. Companies will take notice and they'll adapt their behaviours accordingly.
I'm delighted we have a final question from Dr. Sarangi Mendis.
Hello, my name is Sarangi Mendis. I am an audio-vestibular medicine registrar based at UCLH at the moment. My question is, health professionals are time-pressured, target-driven and seeing increasingly complex patients with multiple comorbidities. How do you think we can practically deliver advice about climate change and its impact on health to our patients?
Well, it's a very difficult thing to do, isn't it? And actually, in some ways, if I was to say that they could and should, I'd be howled at quite rightly, because it's nearly impossible. If you've got 6 minutes in a GP consultation to say hello, sit down, try to do a cursory examination, get a history, explain what you're doing, it's impossible now. And to introduce into that narrative something else about climate change, I think if I was to suggest that, people would just feel beaten up and that I was living in cloud cuckoo land. So I think it's hard and it might not even be possible. But there are ways of doing it. So the first thing is just to do the leadership, let's say in a GP's practice and in a hospital trust. So move to the zero carbon energy supplier, for instance, change the diets inside the practice, what the sandwiches are that are ordered for lunchtime meetings, for instance, what the fruit and vegetables come from and all lead, but then communicate that to the patients. And that can be done by leaflets or posters, just to say, this is really important, this is why it's important. Hey, we've all done it as a practice and we've also done it as individuals. So the leaflets and posters bits works well if you've got a story that having led from the front. Otherwise, it just becomes yet another bit of preaching, which gets largely ignored. The other bit, of course, is that we've learned in the last few years is patient empowerment. We've now got patient-reported outcome measures in trials, patients saying what's important to them. So let's share the work. In any general practice, or indeed around a hospital trust, there will be some very motivated, educated, keen people who want to see the difference in their own community and with you. So if you put it out to your community with a poster on the wall saying, we want to change the way our community works, we want to safeguard ourselves from the climate change and environmental impacts, who'd be up forming the patient committee to drive that? I suspect you would easily find a group of highly motivated, organized people with time to help deliver that for you and to do that communication. And we all know trusted vectors with professional experience have greatest impact. So a doctor telling you not to smoke has much greater impact than anyone else. But remember who comes next in that chain. And that's a trusted person that you know, particularly a family member, actually. So if your daughter says, Daddy, I'd really rather you didn't smoke because I don't want you to die and leave me without a daddy, that's a really important message. And if your next door neighbor who you know and love spreads a message, these are powerful vectors. So let's engage them. So I'm not going to suggest that doctors beat themselves up for not taking 3 minutes of a consultation to talk about climate change. But let's see if we can harness those around us and work with them to deliver that message for us. That's what I would personally be doing.
It's an honor to speak with the Royal Society of Medicine and a special treat to share the podium with three of my most admired climate and health thinkers, Hugh, David, and Tolullah. Well, Hugh has given us his usual eloquent overview, of the depredations we've wrought on our planet and on the threats to human health that follow from climate change. It is an intimidating and even depressing litany of health impacts, and any of us could be forgiven for feeling a bit of despair at this point. In fact, it's that piece that I'd like to take off on. One of the health impacts that Hugh briefly mentioned was mental health, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that as an introduction to part of our role as health professionals in tackling the climate crisis. Now, mental health can be affected by climate change in several ways. First, the severely mentally ill suffer and die disproportionately during heat waves, a function of their inability to detect and take action against danger, and possibly of physiologic vulnerabilities and the psychoactive medications that they may be taking. Following a disaster, the mental health impacts can be very severe and consequential, even eclipsing in the long run the acute effects, the injuries and fatalities that may occur during a disaster. When people are displaced because of agricultural collapse or severe weather or disasters, the phenomenon of being a refugee can have very severe impacts on mental health. And finally, the anxiety and depression to which I referred earlier and which I'd like to discuss in a bit more detail. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about the anxiety and depression that may result from climate change. You've seen media accounts using such terms as climate despair and eco-anxiety and even pre-traumatic stress. In addition to those mental health conditions, there may be some behavioral sequelae. For example, here you see the possibility that students decline to study or decline to attend university, thinking that there may be no future for them, so why would it be worth it? We don't have a lot of empirical data about this phenomenon, but here is an exception, a recently published study from the US, a survey of over 600 people. They were asked about their feelings and behaviors regarding reproductive activity in the face of climate change. The blue bars connote the concern about the carbon footprint of procreation. But what I'd like you to look at is the orange bars, which signal concern about the climate impacts that children will experience. And you can see that between the extremely concerned and the very concerned, 96% ticked yes. This kind of despair is very, very difficult for the people who feel it. We health professionals know that despair is immobilizing. Despair leads to depression, inactivity, withdrawal, whereas hope is a far more positive emotion, leading to positive, constructive engagement and enabling people to carry on with their lives. And we health professionals have some experience in supplanting despair with hope, because it's good for our patients when we can do that. Now, hope is not just a fatuous optimism that everything will turn out okay. Hope at its best is an evidence-based conviction that things may be better and a consequent commitment to action to help make things better. Fortunately, there is plenty of evidence to support the notion of hope in the face of climate change. Let me run through quickly 8 reasons that I believe hope is justified. First, the technology is advancing more rapidly than anybody could have predicted. This slide shows battery technology, which is necessary to facilitate the shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, wind and solar. Battery technology is advancing extremely fast, as are other important technologies. Second reason for hope, the economics are improving. This is a logarithmic scale, believe it or not, showing the rapid decline in the price of solar photovoltaic cells since the 1970s, faster than anybody could have predicted, to the point that now solar energy is cheaper than fossil fuel energy almost everywhere in the world. Third reason for hope, policy is maturing. You will be well aware of some of the commitments made by the UK government. And the UK, of course, is in good company. A number of other governments have made similar net zero commitments. In fact, over 100 countries are at some point in the process of pledging and carrying out decarbonization of their economies. And not only countries, but subnational jurisdictions, cities, states, and provinces are doing the same. There is a lot of action at the local level. Next reason for hope, activism is blossoming. In activism, grassroots activity is enormously influential at driving policy, at making policymakers do the right thing, and at changing public opinion. Next reason for hope, public opinion is shifting. In my own country, one of the more reprobate countries when it comes to belief and action on climate change, you can see that over the last decade, the proportion of people who believe that climate change is real has been steadily climbing. And corresponding to that, the proportion of those who believe that it is a threat to health and that government should take action has been climbing as well. In fact, remarkably, during our last election, the extremely conservative television station Fox News, a Rupert Murdoch station, surveyed voters and asked them if they think government should spend more on green and renewable energy. 70% of Fox viewers who are voters said yes. So this is becoming a widely held sentiment. Next reason for hope, we actually can change. Culture change is possible. We're reminded of that by these posters from the Second World War, from both the UK and the US, asking the public to take action that would be just as appropriate today as it was then. Conserve electricity, conserve water, eat less meat, don't buy things you don't need. The public did respond at the time, and the public can very much respond now as well. Results are emerging. This is a picture of the growth of renewable energy in recent years, with hydro down below, followed by wind and solar above. It is growing rapidly, and the growth is accelerating. So we are seeing change. On the industry side of things, let's take the automotive industry as an example. We're seeing extremely fast shifts to electrical vehicles now. In fact, the major manufacturers are competing with each other to see who can shift faster to electric vehicles. And finally, why all of this matters to us as health professionals is that there is a good news story behind climate action, and that is health benefits. On the left of this slide, you'll see three of the pillars of the shift to a green economy: clean energy, well-designed cities, and healthy, sustainable diets. Well-designed cities comprising pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, good transit, well-insulated, energy-efficient buildings, plenty of green space, and so on. On the right side of this slide, you'll see the public health goals that we share because of the burdens of disease in our societies. Less heart disease, lung disease, and cancer, better mental health, fewer infectious diseases and injuries, and healthy child development. Well, it turns out that there is a good news story lurking between the left and the right sides of this slide. We have solid evidence that clean energy delivers all of the health benefits indicated here. Now, what does that mean for us as professionals? Well, it means many things because each of us is many people. Each of us fills many roles. We are private citizens. We are clinicians, those of us who care for patients. Some of us are researchers. Some of us are institutional leaders, and all of us are trusted community voices. In each of those roles, there are things we can do. In our personal lives, we can make decisions about how we eat, how we travel, and so on. And in doing that, set an example for our friends and our families and our neighbors. As clinicians, we can care for our patients in ways that are climate sensitive, including giving advice to our patients about changes in habits such as how they travel and how they eat that are both healthy and sustainable. As institutional leaders, we can propel our institutions to go green. As researchers, we can incorporate climate into the ways in which we do research and even into the questions we study. And as trusted community voices, we can speak out. Now, this is an important point. Here is a picture of survey responses regarding which professions are most trusted worldwide. You can see that globally, the most trusted professions are scientists and doctors. We are highly trusted, our voice matters, and that gives us both an opportunity and I would say a responsibility to communicate about climate change. Now, how might we do that? Well, one option, which many of us use, is simply to define climate change as out of scope, to say that it's not our job, and to decline to engage the issue. Another option is to communicate about climate change, but to do it in the ways that unfortunately too many scientists do, full of complexity, full of nuance, full of hedging our bets. And the third approach, which you won't be surprised I'm advocating, is basic social marketing. Simple, clear messages repeated often from a variety of trusted sources. Climate change is real. We are responsible. It is bad for health. There are things we can do. And when we do those things, This is a story of opportunity and of better lives, not a story of deprivation and sacrifice. The ways in which we can speak out are numerous, from writing op-ed pieces in newspapers, to offering expert testimony to government bodies, to doing public speaking, and even to participating in protests, an unusual step for health professionals, but one that is potentially visible and highly impactful. Thank you very much for your attention.
Howard, thank you so much for the really positive hope message, which I think is much needed. I'm delighted we've got a question coming in from Dr. Anna Ai.
Hello, my name is Anna Ai. I'm a registrar in infectious diseases and microbiology, currently doing a PhD at UCL. My question is, given the current pressures that all healthcare professionals are under at the moment, what are some of the low-hanging fruits that would enable us to contribute to climate change mitigation?
Some of the things that can be done are upstream from the delivery of healthcare. So preventive medicine, to reduce the demand on the health system in the first place, is a good way to reduce the carbon footprint of the healthcare system. Similarly, identifying and eliminating treatments that do no good, that is eliminating waste in the system, is a good way to reduce the footprint of healthcare. So for example, in our country, we provide loads of ineffective, unnecessary care at the end of life. Within healthcare, there are many opportunities to reduce our carbon footprint. Examining and changing specific technologies, such as the inhalers that we use to treat respiratory disease, the anesthetics that we administer, and so on. Also changing some of our work habits, such as shifting from in-place visits to telehealth visits, replacing our medical conferences in person with medical conferences online. All are ways to reduce the carbon footprint of the healthcare system.
May I just ask, if you were summing up your message of hope for all of those listening, what would you say?
None of us has a crystal ball. One has to admit that things are dire. Some of the data are fairly grim, but this I know for sure. The more we roll up our sleeves and work together to tackle climate change, the better the odds are of good outcomes. Despair gets nothing done, and constructive action, especially when taken together with many other people, gets a lot done. So there's no time for despair. It's time to roll up our sleeves and get to work, and there is a lot we can do.
So I'm going to be talking about integrated action for climate change and health, and I've titled the talk "Bringing the Present into the Future," bringing the future into the present, and hopefully we can see why as I go along. So just briefly, by way of setting the scene, the links between urbanization and health inequality, part of the reasons it's so important to consider the role that urbanization plays is because we know that the patterns of urbanization we see across the world are disrupting ecology because we're pushing boundaries of human settlement. We're setting up housing and human settlements that are increasingly overcrowded and with some poor quality, which, as we know now in the context of the pandemic, facilitates transmission of infectious diseases, but also respiratory and non-infectious diseases. We know that urban exposure globally is increasingly associated with unhealthy environments, inadequate infrastructure, and most concerningly, increasing exposure of young people to these unhealthy exposures, which increase the vulnerability to disease. And lastly, you have inequitable access to care from protection and prevention right through to palliation. So why rethink? Why are we talking about the need for integrated action? Well, we know that many of the factors that influence health lie outside of the healthcare sector. So, and this iceberg really depicts that below that tip of the iceberg of symptoms that we see primarily presenting in the healthcare sector are a myriad of vulnerabilities and exposures that largely lie outside the non-health sector, but play a critical role in determining health. We know that the high impact of the disease burden has a significant impact on economic development. And we see this now very presciently in the context of the pandemic, as we see that without health, we really cannot have a robust economy. And really, we can't afford to focus solely on treating ourselves through, because if we're creating environments that are increasingly unhealthy, we're creating a need that we don't catch up to. So we need a health system that's focused on more comprehensive health beyond just acute episodic care. And I've mentioned here that because health doesn't trickle down from good intentions, in part because we act as though sometimes we just have to do the right things in the urban environment and health and well-being will naturally follow. And my argument is that if we don't actually align the ways in which we support urban processes for health and for sustainability, we don't actually get the healthy and sustainable outcomes. So this is really to, it's very meaty, but to demonstrate some of the interlinked risks when we talk about climate change and health in the context of cities. From an urbanization perspective, what we see is population growth and migration, so both through new birth, but migration rural to urban and urban to urban. We see increasing sprawl, increasing informality, and this industrialization processes happening. So that's the context of urbanization. Simultaneously, we have this context of climate change, where we're seeing changing weather patterns, sea level rise, increased land temperatures. Both of these interact. So we know, for example, industrialization increases some of the exposures that accelerate climate change. They also generate these hazards, so both urbanization and climatic hazards that have knock-on effects to create shocks and stressors that impact on health. So, for example, in the context of urban, we have to consider our energy sources, be that for cooking, heating, or transport, our land use mix and public space, and how we set those up. They play a role in determining whether people have these chronic stresses in terms of perpetual exposure to unhealthy environments and social exclusion. From the perspective of climatic hazards, we see increasingly urban heat islands as a result of the increasing land temperatures, flooding, greenhouse gas emissions, droughts and wildfires. And we're seeing these driving acute shocks that result in socio-political unrest and conflict, dislocation, relocation, that could be temporary or permanent, it could be near or far. And these have implications for the infrastructure, services, and exposures that ultimately impact on both health and climate change. So I lead a research group on global diet and activity research at Cambridge. So we focus a lot on the upstream determinants of diet and physical activity. So for that reason, I've chosen physical activity as a demonstration, thinking about what would a systems approach to physical activity look like in the context of climate change. So just setting the scene, we know that physical activity and mobility are interlinked. So whether you are able to have active travel, say as walking or cycling to work, relates to where you live and how far away you live and your mobility in that context. We know on the health and environmental challenges and emergencies side of things, so these are some of the common emergencies, both health and environmental, we see. In the context of, say, COVID as an example of an emerging new infection, we know that that's also related to obesity, asthma, cardiovascular disease, with an increased risk of severe disease, COVID disease, in the context of those comorbidities. We also know that housing factors have a significant impact on transmission, and the consequence of some of the control measures have significant impacts on social cohesion and connectedness. So that's a broad kind of setting from where we are. From a perspective of physical activity, we know why is it important? Well, that's obvious. We know it addresses the risks of obesity, hypertension, cardiometabolic disease, but also good for mental health. We also know that beyond individual will, the ability to be physically active are really strongly determined by our exposures in our built environments. So where we live or work, so the human settlements, how that's set up, but also our access to shared social infrastructure and public space, be that blue, green, or gray. And so these all relate to land use in the context of cities. But now, if you follow the dotted arrows, human settlements are also associated with how we set up, so how we construct, where we construct, associated with exposure to air pollution, both indoor and out, which obviously is related to greenhouse gas emissions, related to exposure to injury and safety. And we know that these impact on your ability to be physically active. We also obviously know in that context that greenhouse gases accelerate climate change, and these influence physical activity as a knock-on loop. So you're less likely to be physically active if you live in areas that have poor air quality, and you're less likely to be physically active outdoors if you're undergoing extreme weather events that disrupt your built environment. The same thing goes, by the way, for the public space, where we see this associations not just with pollution and injury and safety, but also determining our exposure to social cohesion, stress and isolation, and mental illness. We know air pollution directly increases the risk of stroke. So this kind of gives you a sense of, well, when we're thinking about physical activity, how do we think about how that relates in the context of cities and the impacts both on health and environmental outcomes. So the next time you tell somebody, you see a patient, you tell them, oh, you need to be more physically active. This is what it means to think about a systems approach to improving that.
Tolullah, thank you for a really interesting overview of a topic that many of us probably aren't very familiar with, and it was presented in a very comprehensive and concise manner. Thank you. I'm delighted that the first question comes from a colleague, Dr. Sarah Filson.
Hi, my name is Sarah Ann Filson, and I'm an infectious diseases and microbiology registrar currently working at West Middlesex Hospital. My question is, following the COVID-19 pandemic, what can we do now to encourage change in the way we return back to normal? And how can we ensure that positive changes are made and that sustainability is a priority?
Before the pandemic, I don't think anyone's under any illusion that most cities are not healthy. Most cities are not operating in sustainable ways, right? They were simply unhealthy in ways that we could ignore, right? Either because they were disproportionately felt by the more deprived in the population, or because of that long time arc between the exposure and poor health and environmental outcomes, right? So underneath all of that kind of the societal advances that we've been seeing across cities like London, there was always this darker reality of this widening inequalities, and the pandemic has shown that, right? And this was the first time where we all stopped, and there were certain things that we decided that we couldn't accept, right? So hunger in children, unequally affecting people in the more deprived people, so when we talk about the returning to normal, we have to remember this was a normal where in some boroughs in London, you have up to 1 in 15 people who are homeless. This is a normal where exposure to air pollution was beyond WHO standards for huge parts of London, where children, so increasing greenhouse gas emissions, where you had a child certified as dying from air pollution in London. So that was the normal that we talk about. And so it's really critical to internalize the fact that normal wasn't working. So this is an opportunity to say, well, now that we understand what we can do across society, when there is the will and there is a sense of urgency, what do we want that new normal to look like? And how do we ensure that is fairer? How do we ensure that is more equitable? And really critical to that is bringing the future into the present. So when we look back at this present now, this should be the past that we would be ashamed of.
Tolullah, it's really important to raise the issue of inequalities related to the pandemic and indeed related to climate change. But on a slightly different note, the critical role of youth in the climate change debate has been highlighted by many people. Could you amplify your thoughts on this?
I think youth have a really critical role to play, not just so from a public health perspective, we often think about children and youth as beneficiaries. So if we take the life course approach, it's really important to intervene early in the health of children and youth to protect the health of future adults, etc. That is absolutely critical. But beyond just being beneficiaries of these interventions, youth are really critical agents for change. And I see that some of my research actually is, works with young people to say, actually, how can we engage young people as citizen scientists in the co-creation and co-production of knowledge so that they actually define what the nature of the issue is, and they actually are part of that, designing that solution, and that informs their action and advocacy. So I think really critical. The countries that will fare the best in the future, I think, are those that are able to identify that potential of their youth, are able to privilege and amplify those perspectives, and importantly, to mainstream those perspectives. So I think a lot of the time we're still patronizing and putting youth in a nice to have, but we often talk about children being the future, right? Well, if they're the future and we need to be bringing the future into the present, then we really need to mainstream those perspectives in how we design, how we reset, how we recover, in order for that to be healthy and sustainable, because they're already living in the present.
It's a great pleasure to be part of this very important series of talks run by the Royal Society of Medicine. So I'm just going to say a few words about the voice and actions of health professionals and indeed health and care systems. So just a little bit of background. The business we're all in, we shouldn't need to remind ourselves, is health, and really the positive effect of the health and care system on health. The reason I say that is because people often get health and health care confused. But largely, not exclusively, but largely, the health and care system has a positive effect on health. It's not by any means the most significant determinant of health, but it's very important. Climate change, as I hope you'll need no reminding, is a very bad thing for health in all sorts of ways, which you'll hear from lots of experts on this series. But I just wanted to add in a couple of other dimensions to this. Climate change has a very detrimental effect on the health and care system. It's an enormous logistic enterprise running a health system like the NHS, and floods and extreme weather events and different disease patterns have a very big influence on what is already a very stretched service, not to say nothing of things like pandemics. But also the final part of this jigsaw, which is worth reminding ourselves about, is the fact that the health and care system is actually part of the cause of climate change, in that it's a very large emitter, for instance, of emissions. It's a very large producer of waste. So I know that looks like a very simple diagram, but it's very important to realize which part of the system we're talking about. So in the Lancet in 2009, they highlighted very graphically another very important issue about climate health, not just the climate disease, not just about the effect on health on average, but about the gross disparity and inequalities and social injustice that climate change is causing, not just in this country, in the UK, but around the world. And here's a cartograph representing those of us in countries which produce greenhouse gases, the primary cause of climate collapse. And as you can see, that's largely industrialized countries. But in fact, if you look at the next slide, you'll see where the effects lie, where the burden falls, where the mortality exists. And this is WHO statistics on climate change deaths. Now, that is simply not fair. And it's the cruel irony that those of us who are producing the greenhouse gases are being affected least by it. Very important thing to remember. So it's not just about health, it's about inequalities and social justice, both now and in the future. So just to summarize in first steps, before Professor Luxon and I talk about this a bit more, one of the most important things to remember is that we should be part of a larger movement. And there are plenty of movements. We are blessed in the UK by organizations such as the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change, which is a rallying point for doctors, nurses, and other health professionals through their membership organizations like Royal Colleges of Nursing, Royal College of Physicians, BMA, Lancet, organizations such as that. But also there are other organizations, if you want to take a slightly different angle, which I'll just come on to in a second. But just on the right of that slide, you'll see that we need to articulate climate change as a health issue, as a health emergency. We probably need to stop talking about it as an environmental emergency and talk about it as our core issue. We are health professionals. We are qualified and respected and have the authority to talk about health. So one really important issue about this is talk about climate change as a health issue. And actually, Sir Simon Stevens last October put it very well at the height of COVID by saying that COVID is indeed the most pressing and urgent health emergency facing us. But we shouldn't use that as an excuse to take our eye off the even larger threat to health, which is climate change. And that, as he says there, it poses the most profound long-term threat to the health of the nature. And that's been confirmed by countless other studies. But we have other organizations that if you're, for instance, a medical student, you can join the Students for Global Health, which exists, I think, in almost every medical school in the country. And of course, Health Declares is another organization, as is XR. And I hope you'll need no reminding that the Conference of Parties meeting number 26, COP26, is taking place in this country later in the year in Glasgow, co-hosted with Italy. And it's a very important point, which I'm sure will come up again through this series of talks about what role should health professionals within the UK play at COP26.
David, thank you so much, particularly for highlighting what healthcare professionals can do to take forward the climate change debate. But specifically, how do you think we can embed climate change into medical education?
Firstly, we should make it a big part of that part of our medical school training. Well, I hope it's a big part anyway, it should be, which is around the social, economic and environmental causes of health and disease. And crucially, what we can be doing about it. One of the biases is in our training is we talk a lot about disease rather than health, and we talk a lot about causes and problems and not solutions. So that's the first very obvious thing to do, is that climate change is an incredibly important environmental cause of health and disease, and we should treat it as such within the medical education training curriculum. But the other part of it is we should be embedding it right across all disciplines and crafts. What will rheumatology and what will dermatology look like in a hotter carbon constrained world? What diseases will be? So every ward round, every teaching session may well allude to what is the effect of the way we run the world and how it's changing. For instance, through climate change, what is the effect on how we should be both treating people, but probably more importantly, preventing diseases and how we run the system so we, for instance, mitigate the nightmare of a 3 or 4 or 5 degree world ever happening.
David, I know we both agree that the NHS has been totally overwhelmed in the last 12 months with their sterling work in terms of the pandemic and the COVID-19 problem. But if we put that to one side for a second, what do you think we're doing wrong with respect to climate change?
We need to treat this as a slow burn emergency. And I don't think we're doing that at the right scale and pace. So that's in a sense, our biggest failure. I suppose another really profound failure is simply us ignoring it, not in terms of denying it exists, but more dangerously that acknowledging it, but parking it in the too difficult box, hoping that someone else will sort it out. because we as doctors and nurses are already doing good things and we've already bought ourselves a place in heaven. It's very important that the health system, stands up and visibly acts as though this is the health emergency it really is. But we as individuals have rather unfortunate coping mechanisms where we compartmentalize it and we think, I think someone else is going to solve it. I'm too busy, if you like, saving patients to save the planet. And we forget that actually saving patients and saving the planet is part and parcel of the same issue. We can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet.
Hannah Warren, Urology Registrar in South London. My heart sinks every time I see the amount of single-use plastic that ends up in landfill following even the most basic of medical procedures. Gloves, plastic aprons, and layers upon layers of plastic wrapping for any medical device. Are there any materials in the pipeline that could replace plastic that have the required properties so that we can be more environmentally friendly for medical procedures?
Well, that's a great question, Hannah. So well done for asking it, because it's a very obvious thing. And those of us at the front line, those of you at the front line in COVID have seen this escalate massively during this pandemic. I'm not an expert on plastic and reusables and single use, but one of the things we've got to remember is that plastic is very, very useful. It's a wonderful material, but we should almost treat it as though it's indispensable in its use, but highly toxic when it's not in use or at its life's end. So after a single use or after 20 uses or after 10,000 uses. So one obvious thing is we need to manufacture, when we have to manufacture plastic, we need to manufacture it so it can be reused or biodegraded. So it's not the plastic that in a sense is dangerous, it's the way it ends up in oceans or ends up in landfill to be there for thousands of years toxically that's very important. But actually one of the things that is rather unglamorous in climate change is the rewriting of contracts and business models. So we have about a £20 billion purchasing budget in the NHS. Now, that's to be used in order not only to serve the needs of patients now, but actually to create a sustainable and fair future and make sure we do far more good than harm. And of course, one of the areas in that is to commission not just the move from single-use items to infinitely used, but there's this middle ground of use it 20 times and dispose of it safely and biodegradably. So there's a whole range of things we can be doing to do this, but it's not going to happen automatically. We need to be very conscious about the innovation that happens in the commercial world, that if we were good, if you like, corporate buyers, and we stimulated innovation through very well targeted specifications in our contracts for plastic where it's really going to add benefit, we'll have a lot to benefit from that. So I think plastic is with us to stay in some ways. It's how we dispose of it and how we commission the manufacture and innovation of much safer, less toxic and more reusable plastic that may be part of the answer to that really important question, Hannah.
Earlier in your talk, David, you mentioned COP26, which is happening in Glasgow this November. And what would you like to see happen at that meeting? And how would you suggest that health professionals can support ensuring that the arrangements that are agreed and the decisions that are made are actually met in practice?
COP26 is indeed a huge opportunity, and we shouldn't waste that. I think, firstly, ironically, we should celebrate a bit of success, because I Martin Luther King didn't say I have a nightmare. We have to be positive in some ways in order to create morale. So this country, we do have some things to celebrate in this country. We're the first country to have a Climate Change Act. We're the first country to have a Social Value Act, and actually, in Wales, we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Now, this is a legislative structure that bodes well for the future. It doesn't create the future, but it allows the future to happen in a safe and sustainable and fair way. But also, because it's been held in this country, jointly hosted with Italy, we have to remember that this country could be a very big beacon, not just with its legislative framework for the future. People may not know that we've done a huge amount in this country just to decarbonize our energy system. Not one lump of coal was burnt last summer generating electricity for the national grid. This is already happening. This is an example of the future already happening. And lastly, what I'd say is we have got some fabulous organizations in this country, which any one of us as health professionals could sign up to as many as we like. We have the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change, we have Greener NHS, the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, MedAct, Students for Global Health, Health Declares, XR Health. You could just go on and on. And these organizations have got a good pedigree of acting together when need be. So we should be part of those in whichever way our influence or authority or opportunity allows. You know, the most dangerous thing we can do is nothing.
Well, that's the end of our programme, and I'd like to begin by thanking all our extraordinarily good speakers for superb overviews of the various topics that we're going to be discussing in more detail over the next 9 programmes. I would just reassure you all that tomorrow you're going to be sent resources to support what you've heard this evening, and we will also send out an evaluation form, which we'd be most grateful if you would be kind enough to complete and return, so that we can make sure we're providing what's wanted by our audience. I would like to just remind you that the next session will be on the 30th of March, and on that occasion we'll be talking about respiratory diseases. And I very much hope you've enjoyed this evening, and we look forward to welcoming you to the series and to the next meeting. Thank you.
I do hope you've enjoyed this evening's episode. The Royal Society of Medicine has been very badly affected by the pandemic, and if you were feeling generous, we would love it if you would make a donation to the RSM to support our ongoing work of education and innovation. Thank you so very much.